We've seen how easily our focus can be misdirected, like chasing phantoms in the dark instead of looking where the light is. Now, let's turn that lens on something deeply ingrained: these westernized cultures of honor. We often think of them as ancient, perhaps tied to pastoral life, like herding yaks. But does that fully explain the Southern culture of honor? It's a complex picture, and Fisher's idea about colonial origins gives us a fascinating starting point. Alright, let's dive into Fisher's theory. He basically said, look, America wasn't a melting pot from day one, it was more like a cultural mosaic. You had the Pilgrims rolling out of East Anglia, setting up shop in New England. Then the Quakers, folks from the North Midlands, heading down to Pennsylvania and Delaware. Virginia got its share of Southern English indentured servants. But what about the rest of the South? Fisher argued that a significant chunk came from Scotland, Ireland, and Northern England, places known for their pastoral traditions. His big claim: this specific mix of colonists laid the groundwork for that distinct Southern ethos, particularly the emphasis on personal reputation and retributive justice. It's a compelling narrative, linking geography, migration, and social norms across centuries. Now, Fisher's idea isn't without its detractors. One major hiccup is geography itself. These supposed pastoralist ancestors mostly settled in the hilly backcountry, yet the data suggests the strongest expressions of this honor culture are often found in the more fertile, populated lowlands. So, maybe the pastoral roots aren't the whole story, or maybe the specific type of pastoralism matters more than the region. Others pointed fingers elsewhere, suggesting the constant fear of slave rebellions, a very real historical nightmare, might have been the primary driver for this hyper-vigilant retributive violence. Despite these cracks, though most historians still find Fisher's argument quite convincing, it offers a plausible explanation for a persistent regional difference, even if it doesn't account for every nuance. This culture of honor isn't just about defending your turf against outsiders. Think about it. It's just as potent when the threat comes from within. Imagine being part of a group and someone you know commits an offense that brings shame upon the entire collective. In some cultures, especially those with strong honor dynamics, the response isn't necessarily a quiet family matter. It can escalate dramatically. This leads us to the truly disturbing concept of honor killings. The logic, however twisted, is chillingly simple. If a member's actions tarnish the family's reputation, executing that member publicly can restore the family's standing, their face. It's a brutal mechanism for maintaining social cohesion, albeit through extreme means. While historically widespread, this practice is now largely confined to specific communities, though its existence remains a stark reality. Let's look closer at what typically triggers these horrific acts. The victims are overwhelmingly young women, and the list of offenses is staggering. Refusing an arranged marriage, honor killing; seeking divorce from an abusive spouse, or trying to escape a forced marriage as a child, honor killing; wanting an education, honor killing; resisting religious rules, like covering your head, honor killing; simply interacting with the wrong man, marrying him, dating him, even just speaking to him, honor killing; infidelity, honor killing; converting religions, honor killing. Essentially, it boils down to a woman asserting her autonomy, resisting being treated as property by her male relatives. And here's the truly sickening part: being raped. The victim is often punished for the violation itself, as if her suffering wasn't enough. For men, the trigger is almost exclusively homosexuality. It paints a deeply troubling picture of control and punishment. Now, there's always been this debate: are honor killings just a particularly nasty form of domestic violence? Some argue that Western fascination with them, sometimes tinged with anti-Muslim bias, misses the point. If a Baptist guy in Alabama kills his wife for wanting a divorce, nobody calls it a Christian honor killing reflecting deep religious barbarity. Fair point. But the reality is, honor killings differ significantly. First, the perpetrator is usually a blood relative, not just the partner. Second, it's rarely impulsive rage. It's often planned, sometimes with the tacit or explicit approval of other family members, including women. Third, it's heavily rationalized using religious doctrine, presented without remorse, and sometimes even blessed by religious leaders. Finally, it's done openly, because the goal is public restoration of honor. And sometimes they use underage relatives as perpetrators to minimize legal consequences. By pretty much any measure, calling it just domestic violence feels like a profound misrepresentation. The scale of this issue is alarming. Estimates suggest between 5,000 and 20,000 honor killings occur annually worldwide. And crucially, this isn't happening only in distant exotic locations. Look at the collage. These are just a few examples from the UK, Norway, Canada, the US, Sweden, Germany, Italy, Denmark. Daughters killed by parents or brothers for refusing arranged marriages, for seeking divorce after forced marriages, for dating the wrong person, for wanting jobs, for refusing to wear a hijab, for simply assimilating too much into the surrounding Western society. It highlights a tragic tension. Patriarchal expectations clashing violently with individual autonomy and modernity. The expectation is that daughters remain untouched by the world the patriarch moved them to. Their successful integration becomes a painful reminder of that patriarch's perceived failure or irrelevance. Okay, let's shift gears from specific cultural practices to broader societal structures. A fundamental way to understand cross-cultural differences is by looking at how resources, land, food, power, prestige are distributed. Think about hunter-gatherer societies. Generally, they tend to be pretty egalitarian. Why? Because resources are scarce and easily shared or contested. But things change dramatically when humans invent agriculture and domestication. Suddenly, there's surplus stuff. This creates the possibility for accumulation. The more surplus, the more potential for inequality. And then, boom, the invention of inheritance within families. Once you can pass down accumulated wealth, inequality takes off like a rocket. We're talking levels of wealth disparity in traditional pastoralist or small-scale agricultural societies that can rival, or even exceed, those found in today's most unequal industrialized nations. It's a powerful shift in human history. So, if egalitarian societies existed for millennia, why did stratified, hierarchical ones eventually dominate the planet, often replacing the more equal ones? Peter Turchin offers a pragmatic answer. Stratified societies are just better at conquest. They come pre-packaged with chains of command, hierarchies that make organizing large-scale military campaigns much easier. Makes sense. But there's another angle, especially relevant in unstable environments. Research suggests that when resources get scarce, stratified societies have a grim advantage. They can sequester mortality in the lower classes. What does that mean? It means the existing inequalities in wealth translate directly into inequalities in access to food, healthcare, and ultimately, survival. When times are tough, the rich can weather the storm better, while the poor bear the brunt of the misery and death. Of course, hunter-gatherers have their own strategy for instability, pack up and move. But for settled, large-scale societies, hierarchy seems to offer a grim resilience. Now, let's talk about something called social capital. Forget economic capital, goods, services, money. Social capital is about the intangible stuff: trust, reciprocity, cooperation. How do you gauge a community's social capital? Ask two simple questions. First, can people usually be trusted? In a community where the answer is mostly yes, you see fewer locks. People watch out for each other's kids, intervene in situations. Second, ask how many organizations people participate in: bowling leagues, unions, tenant groups. High participation means people feel they can affect change, that institutions work. People who feel helpless don't join. The bottom line? Cultures with massive income inequality tend to have drastically lower social capital. Why? Trust requires reciprocity, which thrives on relative equality. Hierarchy, by definition, involves domination and asymmetry. Plus, in highly unequal societies, power isn't evenly distributed. The ability to pull strings, to have efficacy, to be visible is concentrated at the top. You can't really have both extreme inequality and abundant social capital. In plain English, marked inequality makes people crummier to each other. And this lack of social capital has tangible consequences, studied across various levels from countries down to towns. More inequality correlates with less helpfulness in experiments, less generosity and cooperation in games, higher rates of bullying, and even antisocial punishment where people punish overly generous players more harshly than cheaters. It suggests a breakdown in prosocial norms. There's also a fascinating psychological dimension. In unequal societies, those at the top often generate justifications for their status. And the more unequal the society, the more the powerful seem to cling to myths about the hidden blessings of subordination. Like, they might be poor, but at least they're happier, or more honest, or more loved. As one paper puts it, unequal societies might need this ambivalence, this contradictory view of the lower classes, to maintain stability. It's a dark psychological mechanism. This erosion of social fabric and trust doesn't just make people less nice, it makes them less healthy. This leads us to a hugely important phenomenon in public health: the socioeconomic status health gradient. Basically, across cultures, the poorer you are, the worse your health tends to be. Higher rates of disease, greater impact of illness, shorter lifespans. Now, before we jump to conclusions, researchers have ruled out some obvious explanations. It's not that poor health causes low SS. Studies show low SS predicts poor health later in life. It's not just a binary poor healthy versus everyone else healthy. The gradient exists at every step down the ladder. It's not just lack of healthcare access. This gradient persists even in countries with universal healthcare, and it affects diseases like juvenile diabetes, where healthcare access wouldn't make a difference. And finally, only about a third of this gap can be explained by direct risk factors like pollution or smoking, plus a lack of protective factors like good mattresses or gym memberships. So, what's driving the rest? So, what's the main culprit behind this health gradient? Key research, notably by Nancy Adler at UCSF, points towards something crucial. It's not so much being objectively poor, but feeling poor. Someone's subjective sense of their financial standing compared to others is at least as good a predictor of their health as their actual income level. Perception matters. But then Richard Wilkinson added another layer. It's not just poverty, it's poverty amidst plenty, specifically income inequality. The surest way to make someone feel poor, Wilkinson argued, is to constantly remind them of what they don't have, thanks to the vast wealth gap around them. It's the relative deprivation, the constant awareness of others' affluence that takes a toll. Why should high-income inequality, independent of absolute poverty levels, make people unhealthy? Two main pathways emerge. First, the psychosocial route championed by Ichiro Kawachi. When inequality erodes social capital, stress goes up. Think about it. Lack of control over your life, unpredictability, no safe outlets for frustration, and weak social support systems. This chronic stress constantly activates our body's stress response, which, as we know, corrodes health in countless ways over time. Second, the neo-materialist explanation from Evans and Kaplan. To improve public health, you invest in public goods, better transit, cleaner water, better schools, universal healthcare. But the more unequal the incomes, the less the wealthy benefit directly from these public goods. Instead, they benefit more from dodging taxes and investing in private goods chauffeurs, gated communities, private schools, insurance. As Evans puts it, the wealthy mount effective political opposition against spending on public goods. This leads to private affluence and public squalor, meaning worse health outcomes for those who can't afford the private solutions. See how both routes feed into each other? This link between inequality and poor health sets the stage perfectly for understanding how inequality also fuels crime and violence. You could almost copy-paste the previous slide, replacing poor health with high crime, and it would fit. Poverty itself isn't the main predictor of crime. It's poverty amidst plenty, or income inequality, that is. Studies consistently show that the extent of income inequality is a major predictor of violent crime rates, whether you look across American states or compare industrialized nations. Again, the reasons mirror the health link. Psychosocially, inequality reduces social capital, trust, cooperation, and mutual monitoring. And materially, the wealthy secede from contributing to public goods. Kaplan's work shows that states with higher income inequality actually spend proportionally less money on education, which is arguably one of the most critical tools for fighting crime. So the same psychological stress and material neglect that harm health also create conditions ripe for crime. Here's a final, slightly depressing point about inequality and violence. Remember how stress responses work? Well, studies on rats and baboons show something interesting. A rat being shocked activates its stress response. But if that rat can then bite another rat, its stress response decreases. Same with baboons. Low-ranking ones reduce their stress hormones by displacing aggression onto even lower-ranking ones. It's not necessarily about overthrowing the system. When inequality fuels violence, it's often the disadvantaged preying on other disadvantaged individuals. There's a great metaphor for this: air rage. Researchers found that the presence of a first-class cabin on a plane almost quadruples the odds of a coach passenger having a major meltdown. Being forced to walk through first class during boarding doubles the chances. It's the constant reminder of the hierarchy. And when air rage is triggered in coach by these reminders of inequality, the result isn't a passenger storming first class shouting slogans. It's the guy being awful to the old lady next to him, or yelling at the flight attendant. The frustration gets displaced downwards. Alright, let's switch focus from internal structures to external ones: population size, density, and diversity. 2008 was a big deal. For the first time in human history, the majority of us lived in cities. This urbanization trend has been beneficial in many ways, especially in developed countries. City dwellers tend to be healthier and wealthier, benefit from larger social networks that foster innovation, and often have a smaller ecological footprint per capita due to economies of scale. But living in a city also changes our brains. A 2011 study scanned people from cities, towns, and rural areas while they experienced stress. The key finding? The larger the population someone lived in, the more reactive their amygdala, the brain stress center, became during that stressor. Urban living clearly has neurological effects. Urban living forces us to do something completely unprecedented among primates, regularly encounter strangers who are never seen again. This invention of the Anonymous Act has huge consequences. Suddenly, traditional methods of norm enforcement break down. How do you enforce rules when you don't know who did what? Larger groups had to develop new mechanisms. We see a trend towards greater punishment for norm violations, and a stronger emphasis on treating strangers fairly. Crucially, we evolved third-party punishment. Instead of just the victim punishing the offender, objective third parties like police or courts step in. At an extreme, a crime becomes not just a personal affront but an offense against the collective, hence phrases like the people versus Joe Blow. The state steps in to manage interactions among strangers. And this brings us to perhaps the ultimate third-party punisher, big gods. Research by Ara Norenzayan suggests that these deities concerned with human morality and punishing transgressions only really emerge when societies grow large enough that people regularly encounter strangers. In smaller, tight-knit groups, you can rely on social pressure and direct consequences. But in large, anonymous societies, you need an omnipresent, impartial judge, hence moralizing gods. It's like outsourcing punishment to a supernatural authority. Contrast this with hunter-gatherer societies, whose gods are less likely to care about whether you've been naughty or nice. Norenzayan's further work shows that the more people believe their moralistic gods are informed and punitive, the more generous they are to strangers of the same faith. It seems these gods serve a function in enforcing social norms within large, diverse groups. Okay, let's separate population size from density. How does crowding affect behavior? A study looked at 33 developed countries and characterized each nation's tightness. Think autocracy, suppression of dissent, constant monitoring, strict punishment of transgressions, life regulated by religious orthodoxy, citizens feeling certain behaviors are inappropriate. The finding was striking. Higher population density predicted tighter cultures. And this wasn't just about current density. It held true, historically, looking back to the year 1500. Crowded places, it seems, tend to foster more controlled, less tolerant societies. This idea of density causing problems gave rise to a famous and frankly deeply flawed study by John Calhoun in the 1950s. He wanted to know what happened to rats when you crammed them together, partly inspired by America's growing cities. His conclusion, presented vividly in Scientific American, was that high-density living produced deviant behavior and social pathology. Rats became violent, adults killed and cannibalized each other, females were aggressive to infants, males engaged in indiscriminate hypersexuality. He used dramatic terms: crowding, going berserk, Amazons, social dropouts, zombies. The article was wildly influential, taught in psychology, architecture, urban planning classes, cited by politicians, and helped shape the narrative that inner cities inevitably breed violence and social decay. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of urbanization. But Calhoun's rats were more complicated than his popular narrative suggested. High density doesn't make rats inherently more aggressive. Instead, it amplifies existing tendencies. Aggressive rats become even more aggressive. Non-aggressive rats become even more timid. It exaggerates what's already there, much like how testosterone, alcohol, or even media violence can make predisposed individuals more sensitive to violence cues. And this doesn't even hold for humans. While there might be correlations in some contexts, like Chicago in the 70s, the link between density and aggression is far from universal. Look at Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, incredibly dense places with incredibly low rates of violence. So, the simple equation of crowding equals aggression is just plain wrong. Okay, let's move from density to diversity, living with different kinds of people. We immediately think of two opposing narratives. On one hand, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. When diverse groups live together, they focus on similarities, transcend stereotypes, trade flows, fairness emerges, and eventually differences blur through intermarriage. On the other hand, sharks versus jets. Proximity breeds friction, cultural pride feels like an attack, public spaces become battlegrounds, and shared resources become tragedies. The reality, of course, is that both outcomes happen. It depends heavily on the circumstances, which we'll touch on later. What's crucial right now is the spatial arrangement of this diversity. Does it matter how mixed or separated different groups are? Imagine a region half Elbonians, half Kerplakistanis, two hostile groups. At one extreme, imagine the land split perfectly down the middle, one boundary. Each group has a contiguous territory, maximal separation. At the other extreme, imagine a micro-checkerboard, alternating squares of one person each, creating a vast number of tiny boundaries between Elbonians and Kerplakis, maximal mixing. Intuitively, both scenarios seem to bias against conflict. Separation minimizes contact, mixing prevents any single group from dominating a public space. But real-world situations are usually somewhere in between, with varying sizes for these ethnic patches. Does the size of these patches, and thus the total length of the border, influence relations? A fascinating study from the New England Complex Systems Institute tackled this. They modeled this Elbonian Kerplaki scenario. As people started to self-sort, they initially formed islands and peninsulas, of one group surrounded by the other, intuitively, a recipe for conflict. But as sorting continued, these islands disappeared. The intermediate stage actually maximized the number of isolated enclaves, maximizing the potential for conflict. Then, they applied this model to the Balkans, just before the devastating wars of the 1990s. By analyzing different possible ethnic patch sizes, they identified areas theoretically most prone to violence, based purely on fragmentation patterns. And guess what? These matched remarkably well with the actual sites of major fighting and massacres. The takeaway? Violence can arise from the structure of boundaries themselves. Interestingly, the study also found that clear, natural borders like mountains or rivers between groups can actually promote peace, allowing for partial autonomy within a single country. Sometimes well-defined separation works better than forced integration. Beyond just population size and density, what about chronic, pervasive threats? Remember that study linking country tightness to things like high population density? Well, it also found that tighter cultures historically faced more chronic food shortages, lower overall food intake, and diets lower in protein and fat. Basically, cultures constantly living under the shadow of hunger tended to be more tightly controlled. Environmental degradation also plays a role. Less farmland, less clean water, more pollution correlates with tighter societies. Think about Jared Diamond's collapse. Environmental degradation is a recurring theme explaining the violent collapse of civilizations. When the environment fails, social control often tightens. Disease is another major chronic threat. We have this concept of behavioral immunity, our ability to detect sickness cues in others, which can lead to xenophobia. Historically, cultures plagued by infectious diseases tend to be more closed off to outsiders. The same study linking to tightness found that cultures with high historical incidence of pandemics, high infant and child mortality, and lots of years lost to communicable diseases were also tighter. Weather and climate also play a role. Obviously, wars pause in winter. But Mazrui argued Europe's success partly stemmed from planning driven by the necessity of winter. Larger-scale weather events, floods, droughts, cyclones predict tighter cultures. And consider El Niño, the periodic warming of the Pacific. It's linked to droughts and food shortages in many developing countries, and studies show it roughly doubles the likelihood of civil conflict, likely by fanning the flames of existing tensions. But the drought violence link is tricky. That El Niño study referred to civil wars between government forces and rebels fighting for power perks. However, in traditional settings, drought might actually decrease conflict. Think about it. When resources are scarce, everyone's focus shifts to survival, foraging longer hours, hauling water. Raiding for women or cows becomes a lower priority when you can barely feed your own family. There's a great example from baboons. Normally, in rich ecosystems, baboons spend only a few hours a day foraging, leaving 9 hours for social maneuvering, flirting, gossiping. During a devastating 1984 East African drought, even though food was still available, it took every single waking moment to get enough calories. And guess what? Aggression plummeted. Ecological duress can either increase or decrease aggression, depending on the context. Quick detour on religion before we wrap up this section. Why do humans keep inventing religions? It's more than just a general pull towards the supernatural. Mickey Mouse has supernatural powers, but no one worships him or fights over him. Religion serves functions. It makes in groups more cooperative, helps us grapple with the unknown by personifying forces and finding causality. Maybe it's even an emergent property of our social brains. The sheer variety is mind-boggling. Thousands of religions, wildly different in their beliefs about gods, afterlives, sin, founders, and goals attracting new members versus keeping current ones happy. It's a fascinating human phenomenon. Despite the variety, there are some patterns. Desert cultures tend towards monotheism, rainforest dwellers, polytheism. Nomadic pastoralists often have war god deities. Agriculturalists invent gods who control the weather. And critically, once societies get large enough for anonymous interactions, they start inventing moralizing gods. Furthermore, cultures facing frequent threats, whether from war, natural disasters, or high levels of inequality and infant mortality, tend to have more dominant religious systems and orthodoxy. Religion seems to scale up in importance and moralizing capacity in response to complexity, anonymity, and insecurity. So, to quickly summarize religion, it reflects the values of the culture that creates or adopts it, and it's incredibly effective at transmitting those values. It can inspire incredible acts of kindness and cooperation, but also horrific acts of cruelty and division. In short, it's complicated. Which brings us to the really big contentious question that has scientists arguing as much as philosophers did centuries ago. Has humanity become more or less decent to itself over history? The classic debate. Hobbes' short, nasty brutish and nasty versus Rousseau's noble savage. Today, this debate is fueled by actual data archaeology, contemporary studies. When did war get invented? Does civilization tame us or unleash our worst tendencies? Do warriors get more genes? Has civilization actually civilized us? This is the heart of the matter. Did humans start off brutish and get better, or were we originally peaceful and corrupted by civilization? The modern debate uses archaeological evidence and contemporary observations to try and answer this. A huge sticking point is when war was invented. Did organized violence precede complex societies, or is it a product of civilization? Does being a successful warrior confer evolutionary advantages? Has the centralization of power in states actually led to more peace, or just more sophisticated forms of violence? It's a fundamental question about human nature and history. How do we study war from the past? Archaeologists often use a streamlined definition: numerous people dying violently at the same time. Lawrence Keeley's 1996 book, War Before Civilization, argued forcefully that the archaeological record shows widespread and ancient warfare. Steven Pinker's monumental 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, largely agrees with Keeley on this point, arguing that while violence has declined in recent centuries thanks to civilization, the roots of warfare go way back. They point to compelling evidence: mass graves filled with skeletons showing multiple fractures, smashed skulls, defensive wounds, stone projectiles embedded in bones. Some sites look like battlefields dominated by young adult males. Others look like massacres with butchered remains of all ages and sexes. Some sites even show evidence of cannibalism of the defeated. These aren't rare anomalies. They're found across continents and millennia, from Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, 12,000 to 14,000 years old, to Crow Creek in South Dakota, 700 years old, a mass grave of over 400 skeletons, 60% showing violent death. Across 21 such sites, Keeley and Pinker estimate about 15% of skeletons show signs of warfare, though they acknowledge this is likely an underestimate. Beyond mass graves, Keeley and Pinker highlight other clues. Prehistoric settlements were often fortified with palisades and walls. And then there's Otzi the Iceman, the 5,300-year-old mummy found with an arrowhead embedded in his shoulder. These aren't ambiguous signs. Both Keeley and Pinker argue there's been a pacification of the past, a tendency among archaeologists to downplay or ignore this evidence. Keeley suggested post-World II archaeologists, traumatized by the horrors of World II, recoiled from the idea that humans had been preparing for such conflicts for millennia. Pinker, writing from a younger generation's perspective, suggests the current reluctance to acknowledge ancient violence is a form of nostalgia, perhaps longing for a mythical prehistoric idol. But the evidence, they argue, screams otherwise. Predictably, Keeley and Pinker's claims generated a massive backlash. Many archaeologists accused them of warifying the past. The most vocal critic, R. Brian Ferguson, has published extensively on this, including a paper titled Pinker's List, Exaggerating Prehistoric War Mortality. The critiques are numerous. First, some sites cited contain only one violent death, suggesting homicide, not war. Second, the criteria for inferring violence, like proximity to arrowheads, are flawed. Many artifacts are just chips or flakes, not weapons. Even at Jebel Sahaba, the excavator considered most projectiles mere debris. Third, many fractured bones were healed, possibly indicating ritualized club fighting, not warfare. Fourth, proving human cannibalism versus carnivore gnawing is tough, and even documented cannibalism doesn't tell you if it was enemies or relatives being eaten. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, Keeley and Pinker are accused of cherry-picking data, focusing on the few dramatic war sites while ignoring the vast majority of the archaeological record where violent death rates are much lower. Absence of proof is not proof of absence, Ferguson argues. Supporters retort that you can't ignore sites like Crow Creek or Jebel Sahaba, and the critics are missing the bigger picture. So, if interpreting ancient bones is contentious, what about studying living humans in contemporary non-state societies? Keeley, Pinker, and Samuel Bowles argue that warfare is nearly universal in these societies. Think headhunters in New Guinea and Borneo, Maasai warriors in Africa, Amazonian raiders. Keeley estimates that 90 to 95% of tribal societies engage in warfare, often constantly, and a much higher percentage are at war at any given time compared to state societies. For Keeley, the rare peaceful tribes are usually just those that have been defeated by their neighbors. He even charges anthropologists with systematically underreporting violence to pacify living relics of the past. The images here give you a sense of the groups involved: Papuans, Maasai, Amazonians, Zulu. But again, anthropologists push back strenuously. Accusations of cherry-picking resurface. Pinker's analysis heavily features groups from the Amazon and New Guinea highlands, while global surveys yield much lower rates. Pinker's critique of anthropologists studying peaceful groups like the Semi, whom he pejoratively calls anthropologists of peace, has been met with testy defenses from the researchers themselves, who call themselves peace anthropologists and emphasize their objectivity. Other studies of the Yanomamo, the tribe often invoked as the fiercest people, report vastly different levels of violence. And the cornerstone of the warrior gene argument, Neplian Changyon's finding that Yanomamo killers had more offspring, has been thoroughly debunked by Douglas Fry. Fry showed it was an artifact of comparing older killers to non-killers, ignoring age differences, and fundamentally flawed analysis. Crucially, it doesn't generalize. Other cultures show no such link, like the Nangatom pastoralists, where stealth raiding, not open battle, predicted reproductive success. Plus, these groups aren't pristine stand-ins for prehistory. They often have access to modern weapons, live in degraded habitats, and are affected by outside contact. Both sides see a lot at stake here. Keeley expresses a weird worry near the end of his book. If the past is pacified, the implication is that the only way to end war is to ditch civilization altogether and return to tribal ways. It's a strange conclusion. Critics on the other side have deeper concerns. They worry that painting indigenous peoples as inherently violent, like the Yanomamo or Aceh, provides a justification for stealing their land. Stephen Corey of Survival International argues Pinker's work promotes a fictitious colonialist image of a backward, brutal savage, pushing the debate back over a century and still used to destroy tribes. It highlights how these academic debates can have very real-world consequences. So, wrapping up this section, we've seen how deeply cultural factors, whether it's a culture of honor, the distribution of wealth, the size and density of populations, or the presence of religion, shape human behavior, including our propensity for violence and cooperation. The debate over whether war is ancient or a product of civilization remains fiercely contested, reminding us of the immense complexity in interpreting both the distant past and the present. Understanding these intricate dynamics is absolutely essential as we try to navigate our shared future.